Hello and welcome to the Conscious Youth Podcast. Today we're here with Lilia Kardenas. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Jake. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about having a conversation together. I am an English teacher, a nondual therapist, and generally a person who is very curious about how things work. And to explore how things work, I think it's necessary to explore how mind works. So I consider myself a mind scientist in a certain sense. I'm very interested in truth. And that is something that I love to explore and to communicate to other people.
Yeah, it's the same for me. Anything to do with the truth or the deeper things in life, you can't not be interested in it.
Absolutely. Have you been doing this podcast for a long time?
No, it's only recently I've started it. I've only got 2 episodes up at the minute. I started it about 2 weeks ago, and I'm just trying to get as many people on with the non-dual understanding so we can just share this message.
Wonderful.
So what's the best way you would describe non-duality to someone that's never heard of it or that don't quite understand it yet?
An interesting way that comes to mind would be to ask them what they think about it and then probably help them explore what it is. I think non-duality is a fancy term that is thrown around quite a lot.
Yes.
And I think everybody tends to have their own definition of non-duality. Many people equate it and conflate it with mantras and rituals and wearing a wreath of flowers on your neck.
Yeah.
So that would be a classic, a hippie understanding of non-duality that people may have, just because that word is often used in conversations about spirituality.
Yes.
But in general, I would not want to impose my understanding of non-duality onto anyone. And if I were asked this question, I would try to do my best to help the other person explore the nature of their being. I think that is ultimately what non-duality boils down to.
Yes.
Who we are. Why are we here? Why is experience that we're experiencing happening the way it is? Why is it not happening some other way? Who we think we are. I think in non-duality, what is happening now, because this thing, this term, this trend is becoming popular, people start having beliefs about non-duality. And what we tend to do is we put the cart before the horse. In a certain way, we adopt a belief, we adopt a belief such as everything is one. Love is something that connects all of us. You are God. Everything is perfect already. I have no boundaries. And instead of openly exploring whether or not that is the case, we may feel drawn to adopt this belief and then try to make sure that the experience agrees with this belief. So it's the other way around. That's why I think it's so important to actually start where we actually are, to start with the truth. With the truth as we see it. So if a person thinks, for instance, that, I feel that I am myself, and to me, myself is my limited being residing somewhere in my chest, then that's where we start. We don't start by saying that we are all one wonderful unity, and then we try to
start with the self. Start with the self.
Start with what is true
for
the self, I think.
So it's interesting you say that you're a non-dual therapist. Have you done, was you into therapy before the non-dual understanding, or has it came together?
So basically, I had been in therapy. I had been doing therapy, and I was mainly doing it from a position of a therapist who sees a self as a collection of fragments or parts.
Yes.
I had not had a particular understanding as to that self being a construction in consciousness, of the activity in consciousness. I didn't see the self for what it was. I just saw it for the way it worked.
A very materialistic view of the self, the way that
I think so.
Society puts it together and the way that you're taught to give it to other people.
Absolutely. I was also exploring it and trying to figure out which methods worked in therapy. And some traditional therapeutic methods do really work. And they're often thrown out with the bathwater, I think. when non-dual therapists come along, you know. So for instance, that mindfulness meditation that may be looked down on by many non-dual people as, oh, you know, that's spirituality 101. You don't even understand what you are doing because you're looking at things as just separate objects. But it really works, you know. There is an occasion for everything.
That's where I started with mindfulness meditation. It just started from there and then progressed into what it is now. So I think everyone's got to start somewhere, and it's not got to be right at the deep end, if you want to call it that, or everyone's got to take time, and everyone takes time to come to the understanding of.
Yes.
So how would you say to someone, how would you deal with trauma in someone without the non-dual understanding and with the non-dual understanding? What would be, I know it varies from person to person, but what would be your, what would be your approach?
I actually think that the non-dual understanding is not contrary to the traditional understanding of trauma that I personally had. I think they're actually quite complementary.
Yeah, they go together, but for the people that don't quite.
Yes,
you know.
Absolutely. So the first thing I would want my client to recognize, what I would get them to recognize, is that they have different parts within themselves that have different expressions. For instance, you can see this with yourself when you have conflicting needs, for instance, or conflicting desires. Maybe you want to start a business one day and you imagine how amazing that would be, and you're almost ready to sit down and write a business plan for that. But then next day you kind of go, what, you know, me starting a business? Oh, come on, you know, I will never do that. And then on the third day, there will be another part that will come along and say, oh, no, you know, we need to do integration. We need to better ourselves, you know, and stuff like that. So I would get my client to recognize that all those different expressions are, one, valid, that there is a good reason why these expressions come up the way they do. And then second, that harmony, peace, and happiness, which everybody ultimately wants, lies within the integration of the bringing together of all those parts. So what we're going to do in therapy is to bring every single expression of ourselves, that we may call, using a fancy word, parts in therapy, bringing that together and seeing how we can create friendship and loving understanding within ourselves of all those parts, so that we don't bulldoze some of our parts, that we don't see them as not valid or not useful or sabotaging ourselves. I think there is this interesting subject in therapeutic circles that we may be standing in our way sometimes. And I don't think many therapists hold this view. I think actually many people who come to have therapy hold this view. Very often I would hear people say things like, I'm just in my own way. I feel I'm in my own way all the time. I'm not letting myself do what I want. And I recognize that it's me that is somehow wrong.
Yes.
And what we try to do in therapy is to understand that every one of our parts is formed for a specific reason and holds a truth, a personal truth. And none of our parts do things randomly. If we get angry, there is a good reason for us getting angry. Maybe we're feeling incapable, and our anger is our protector, in fact, which wants to take our attention away from us feeling incapable to live life, for example. Or if we're feeling depressed, maybe we may feel that there is this absolute futility in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And we create this depression as an effect to maybe produce a certain outcome. So depression is not as passive as we may think. It is actually a mechanism that pushes us to do something for a very good reason.
To propel us forward. See,
absolutely.
It's interesting because I suffered deeply with depression before I come to understand a lot of it. And it's like I've took myself through the journey, because I never went to a therapist or anything like that. I just sort of did it all myself. I was determined that if I was depressed, I need to understand why. And I refused to take medication because I'm not saying that's a good idea for everyone, but I refused to take medication because I wanted to understand really why. And it was sort of that's led me down this path, and just slowly understanding myself through my own way of doing it is taught me so much. It's taught me so much about myself, and you probably could help. It would help to have someone with therapeutic understanding to guide you through some of this stuff, because it's taken me a few years, but I've slowly dealt with all my own trauma through meditation, through mindfulness, through just general practice and understanding, just feeling my own being. And I did all that just simply from feeling my being. As simple as it sounds. I put myself, it was strange. How would you describe like a dissociation disorder?
A dissociation disorder.
How would you describe that?
I think.
Yeah.
Are you interested in the non-dual interpretation?
Yes, because I think what happened is I didn't really realize that I was dissociating until I went through all these meditations, and then realized that I was actually dissociating quite a lot. And I was using the non-dual understanding as another way to dissociate. It wasn't until I brought the dissociation together with the person I wanted to be. It was strange. I had to integrate the two. And then once I'd integrated the two, it was just, that was like the blossoming. And I didn't realize. Yeah.
you answered your own question, Jake.
Yeah.
Do you realize that?
Yeah. I do that also.
So I could sit here all day and basically tell you how common dissociation is in spiritual circles. That is basically the most common dynamic that you will see in the spiritual circles. And look, let's be honest, many people come to non-duality because they're suffering. Yes. And their suffering is mainly connected with some part of their physical experience. So maybe it's a trauma that they suffered, and they may link it to specific circumstances. And every time a sound, a smell, a word, a specific signature in a person comes up in their experience, they will see that as a trigger. Not necessarily they will do that consciously, they will do that unconsciously.
Yes.
And they will respond. So there is always this physical trigger that elicits a response in a being. And it's interesting that spirituality basically offers you an amazing way to deal with that. It says physical is an illusion. So what is bothering you is an illusion.
Yes.
And it looks like what you are sharing is that you are saying that you came to a point where you realized that integrating the physical is also very important, because otherwise you're just creating a new duality.
Yeah. For a while, I was like separating myself. I was like using my practice as a way to escape the feelings that I didn't want. And then when the practice stopped, those feelings I didn't want came back up again. And I was struggling they was contradicting each other, because in one understanding, I was feeling peace and love and bliss. And then in another understanding, and then when I went back, there was all this, it was just sort of numb. Those feelings wasn't there. And the understanding was still there, but the feelings wasn't connected between the two. So that's where it was contradicting, because it's like, why do I feel numb if when I'm practicing, I feel love, bliss, and understanding? But when I'm not practicing, it's not. So it took a while to put that together.
Absolutely. And when you do put that together, the thing such as paradox stops to exist.
Yes.
Because we do struggle a lot with paradox, don't we? We kind of see paradox traditionally, maybe in scientific circles, or at least that's how I saw it in my skeptic stage in my life. Yes. We tend to see it as a negation of the validity of a method. Whenever there is paradox, we put a large red cross over something whenever we spot that there is something contradictory within that thing.
Yes.
But I think it's really natural that we see paradox, because unless we do integration, unless we realize that we comprise everything, and I literally mean everything, I literally mean Zelensky and Putin, love and hate, everything, that's all us. Unless we recognize that, there will always be contradiction, and we will see that contradiction. because that will be the way that things work for us, you know.
Yes.
But only from the position of the understanding, which is the non-dual understanding, that everything is one, that everything is already contained within this one singular field. Only from this understanding we recognize that paradox is only a thing that exists if we divide something that is indivisible into separate parts, because that division is artificial. Ultimately, there will be drawbacks to it. That's how paradox emerges.
It's wonderful. It really is.
It is.
I could imagine from your perspective, like with you training to be a therapist first and then realizing what the non-dual says about the self, I could imagine that was a light bulb moment for you, putting those two together, and how powerful it'd be to integrate traditional therapy with non-dual therapy.
Yes. An interesting thing about non-dual therapy is that once you learn it, everything clicks.
Yes.
I don't know if you had this feeling in your childhood, maybe when you were at the stage when you were starting to think of yourself as being a certain way. Maybe you started thinking of yourself, I'm this guy who likes cars, for example.
Yeah.
For me, it was like, I am this girl who likes vampires, because vampires were a big thing when I was growing up. And when I started conceptualizing of myself this way, as I would presume everyone does, there were certain inconsistencies. Like, for example, I noticed that there were moments when I really wanted to hate vampires, but then I felt, but there will be a discrepancy because in fact, I am the one who loves vampires. So I was kind of seeing those inconsistencies in the concept of self, which I didn't think of as a concept back at that time.
Yes.
But that was emerging. And also I think with therapy, this is the same dynamic that may happen in therapy and actually inform the desire of a therapist to transition into something that is greater than traditional therapy. Because in traditional therapy, you may start seeing that certain things just don't work. For example, the classical positive psychology, for instance, working with the positives, focus on the positives.
Yes.
One day, a client may come into your office and say, and that will be a very legitimate question, I think, why should I focus on the positive rather than the negative? Aren't they somehow equal? I'm just thinking, why is it the positive, not the negative? Am I not just engaging in wishful thinking when I'm trying to focus on the positive all the time? Does it make any sense? Like, why? So they will start asking those questions. And if you're a traditional therapist, I don't think there is any good way you can tell a client why a positive is better than the negative, because the client is ultimately right. There is no difference between the positive and the negative.
Yes.
So that's a legitimate question.
And I think, traditional therapy would struggle to answer that question because they probably don't have the deeper understanding that the two are connected, or maybe they're very not open-minded and just dismiss it, but surely that's not always beneficial to the client.
Yeah. And also an interesting thing is that when you're working on transformation, which I think for many of us is the goal when we go to have therapy, we want to become more effective in life. I think that the way traditional therapy approaches transformation is not very effective, because you cannot create a genuine transformation unless you recognize rather that what you are transforming is ultimately unreal. There will be identification with something that you think is real about you that you don't want to transform if you identify with a limited thing or a limited way of being. Are you following me?
Yes.
So ultimately, if you think of yourself as inauthentic, then if you go into therapy, you will try to become authentic. But because you are already identified with being inauthentic, the real transformation will be impossible. Because even if you learn behaviors that will communicate to the rest of the world that now you are authentic, and maybe people will give you feedback and that will tell you that, maybe you're on the path of authenticity and now you're way more authentic than you used to be. Still, there is some way that you're identifying with, and you will still be struggling to become more authentic. Because why would you struggle to be authentic? Because deep inside you feel that you are inauthentic. So you're doing nothing to inauthenticity within yourself. And in non-dual, if we follow the non-dual understanding, many non-dual people will recognize that you are none of that. You are neither authentic nor inauthentic. You are neither capable nor incapable. You are neither good or evil. You are none of that. Your life is neither meaningful nor meaningless.
Yes.
Many people see meaningless as a negative. So even though we may recognize, some people, when we approach non-duality, we may think, life is meaningless. But then they will put a negative spin on that thing. So they're adding meaning.
I've had that a few times. You're trying to express the beauty and the depth of it, and they're just taking it as a way of bypassing everything. But it's not. It's really an inclusiveness of everything. Yes, that's where it's misunderstood. It's
neither.
Yeah, or neither. So, when would you say that the understanding really clicked for you? Was there a teacher that put it into perspective for you, that made it click? Was there, did you have any spiritual influences?
Yes, I found this YouTube channel titled actualized.org. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
There is this guy called Leo Gura, and his way of presenting things really resonated with me, because in my deepest core, I'm a very curious one. This one is very, very curious. And he seemed to be very curious as well.
Yes.
So we resonated. I felt, this guy, he wants to turn every rock. He wants to look under everything, to see how things work. So I really resonated. And he had this option on his website where he reviewed the best books on spirituality and also other areas of life. Health, medicine, science, politics, you name it.
Yeah.
So I got that list and I started going through the books within that list. This list was very comprehensive. It covered different areas of life, not only spirituality. And those books that he selected for that list were very high quality. They were not written of a position of limitedness and hatred, but rather they were written from a position of inclusiveness. That's why I found so much wisdom in those books, even though they were written by very, very different authors from all walks of life.
Yeah.
And that's how I found my first spiritual teacher, Peter Ralston. Peter Ralston is a no bullshit man. He has a very, very clear-cut approach to non-duality. And one thing that he taught me, or rather that the being with him and around him taught me, was being very vigilant every time a belief would come up. So that really helped me understand that whenever we base anything on belief, that's when we're running away from truth.
Yeah. So
belief and truth would be two things, making the distinction between which would be very, very helpful for a seeker, I think.
Yeah.
As we talked earlier in this conversation, we mentioned that sometimes people may put the cart before the horse, in the sense that we adopt a belief in meditation that something should be a certain way, that maybe meditation will lead us to opening up our heart, and that's how we approach meditation. So then we sit down and we try to feel when the heart will be open, instead of contemplating what is actually true in our experience. So Peter Ralston taught me that, and I'm very grateful for that. He also made me very vigilant to the notion of ideals that we have for ourselves. And he also taught me to draw a distinction between enlightenment, ergo non-dual abiding consciousness, direct experience, and transformation, which has to do with how we construct our identity, if we want to construct one, because not constructing any is also an option. And it turns out that it's a very liberating option.
Yes, and that's one thing I didn't take into consideration for a while. Like you say, there's the non-dual understanding experience, the very direct experience. Like if you don't integrate that, like that's another thing with integration into it and the transformation. If you keep that separate from the integration, I don't think you can keep them apart, to be honest. I think I think ultimately they will just merge together anyway.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a very important point about psychology, I think. Psychology happens in consciousness. So we, as consciousness is doing psychology. Therefore, it would be erroneous, I think, to say that psychology is somehow contradicting non-duality. Yeah. Psychology is happening in non-duality. It's just one, it's one of the ways consciousness is manifesting itself, which is so interesting,
yeah,
I think.
So this is a little off subject, but quite,
sorry, Jake, before you ask that question, can I just restart my camera to make sure that everything is recorded?
Yes, no worries.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Yeah, I'm back.
So you mentioned actualize.org, and I know he deals with psychedelics. So I've also dabbled in psychedelics, and they've taught me so much that they was sort of the way that helped me change those deep beliefs, which I didn't realize that I was clinging onto. So how do you think that psychedelics also fit into the non-dual understanding in the way
they're definitely, sorry.
So yeah, in the way that they can sort of help push us towards understanding?
They're definitely a manifestation of consciousness, aren't they?
Yes.
Aren't they?
Yes.
They're like a table or a monitor or a painting. You know, I have some wonderful paintings on the wall. And I think the reason that this question is often asked about psychedelics is because there are contradictory ideas about psychedelics. However, if we go and look at a painting, there are no contradictory ideas about a painting.
Yeah.
So, you know, I have no direct experience with psychedelics. So everything I might say about their particular effect would be a speculation based on hearsay and what I've heard.
Yes.
And because Peter Ralston told me not to rely on belief in saying things, then I can't form a valid opinion about psychedelics.
So,
you see?
So for me,
I think you can tell me much more.
Yeah. So for me, there was the deep depression, and it got to a point where I was like, you know, it's something I didn't really want to do before, because I knew and know people that have done it, and they've told me about how it can really, your mentality really can get slippery, and things become loose. And so I was like, you know what, I'm feeling this way anyway, I'm just gonna do it. And I did get warned. They said don't take that much, and it says if I'm doing it, I'm doing it. It was very irresponsible, but it was taught me a lot. And about 40 minutes later, everything started to become wiggly. If you've heard Alan Watts, when Alan Watts talks about everything becoming wiggly, that's
what you experienced.
Yes, it was an actual experience, that everything was wiggly and everything was sort of merging together, and there was nothing solid. There was nothing solid whatsoever. So it was like taking the spiritual wisdom and taking the spiritual words that we hear and putting it into it's like putting a VR headset on and experiencing those words, but for an actuality through seeing and the mentality. And I'm not going to lie, it was terrifying. It was a bad experience. I think I had a psychotic break, but that was essentially it was like a restart. It was like someone hit the reset button, because I went into like a manic mode, and by the end of it, it's like my mind couldn't cope anymore. And I think what was happening is the depression was getting projected into a visual aspect, because there was like a dark cloud that was following me around the whole time. And it was like this dark cloud was putting weight on me, and that was the visual representation of the depression. And then by the end of the night, it was like a mini explosion went off inside my head, and I was just left feeling like a newborn baby. That's the best way I could put it. I was left feeling like a newborn baby. I was just seeing everything for the first time. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what anything was. I just knew that it was. That's the only thing I could say. And it was from that moment that I knew that there was a lot more to life than what I thought there was before. And it led me on that. Yeah, it led me on that journey, definitely.
Well, it looks like you found that perfect moment from which you can do effective transformation.
Yeah.
When you're absolutely blank, you know, the preconditioned state of the mind.
Yes.
Which is absolutely blank. And I think I have this conviction that, in fact, in my experience, that would be the most fruitful place from which we can reform.
Definitely, because from that moment, that's when I didn't even realize it. I started to rebuild my life in a different way. I started to look at things in a more, not positive way, but more optimistic. Because before, with the depression, everything was so down and nihilistic, and everything was bad. But from this brand new perspective, this brand new slate cleaned, I could go back into life and decide which way I wanted to view it now. It was a wonderful experience because it gave me the opportunity to try to start again. It was literally,
it's wonderful.
It's like I died, but psychologically. I'd literally died.
It's wonderful what you're sharing.
Yeah. Yes, it was an awesome experience. And then I had one more time after that. And the funny thing is with psychedelics is, I don't know if you've heard Actualize talk about it, but they will teach you what you need to understand. It's like, so I did, so that was the first time I did it. That was LSD. And it's very long lasting. It's like 8 hours. And then I'd heard about DMT, and they call it the spirit molecule. And having understood what I understood through the LSD, I thought, well, if I understood this much through that, I wonder what I can understand through DMT. So I did the DMT, and that was, that's a lot more intense because it just hits you in a matter of seconds. And I got transported to this beautiful place, but you get spoken to in not in words, but you get spoken to through telepathy, if that's the best way to say it. And the message I got was, why are you doing this? You've already got the understanding you need. Put it down. And it reminds me of when Alan Watts says, once you've got the message, hang up the phone. Don't keep going back to it because you clearly don't need it. You're just messing with it for the sake of it now. And I never did it again after that. And I never needed to.
Yes. In fact, spirituality may be a coping mechanism for many people. That could be one way of managing life, you know, always returning back and back and back and never retiring.
Yeah.
Never retiring and actually saying, yeah, I've got it. You know, I've got it. And now I can go and live life. I think in spiritual circles, it's interesting that I would have this belief and way of seeing things, and I don't know, maybe some of the listeners will also have this. When you get into spirituality so deep that you identify with it as a way of being,
yes,
and then it's very difficult for you to let go of it, and you think of the new goal right now of you becoming a spiritual teacher of a kind. It's like a university, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. So if I kind of graduate through this spirituality process, then the pinnacle of it will be like me writing a book about spirituality, or like something in the realm of spirituality.
Yes.
Maybe becoming a spiritual guru or something, or starting a YouTube channel about it or anything. I don't mean to say that those things are wrong or somehow not to be done. I think they're fantastic things, but provided they stem from a genuine desire to not be able to do otherwise, you know.
Yes.
You will know if you can't do otherwise. You're doing this podcast, so perhaps you could not do otherwise. You cannot not do it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that spirituality is very powerful once you take it into all other areas of life. For example, I work as an English teacher, and when people come internationally and they have lessons, that's a very different level of having English lessons for them, because their teacher has this non-dual realization. So that seeps into everything that we do. Or if we go and do gardening, if we go and collect litter, or if we talk to a neighbor, whatever we do, if we work in a nuclear plant, I'm pretty sure we need more people who would go and work in a nuclear plant from a non-dual understanding than spiritual gurus. We have plenty of those.
Yes. You need, yes, like you say, we need more people in the relative sense to go into
Absolutely.
the world and to share that. It's interesting for me because I actually work as an Amazon delivery driver. So I meet all these new people all the time, and it's strange because I come to them. I've never met them before, but I'm coming to them, and I don't know if they can sense this. I don't know, but I generally seem to get on with everyone I meet. And I think because I approach it with, I don't know the best way to say it, but I approach them with this non-judgmental point of view and understanding that they're even awareness, and everyone is that. So there's just that instant connection with everyone.
You're in a much better position than some spiritual guru, I think. And that very often we kind of think that the best way to reach people is to become a spiritual vessel of wisdom in a direct way, in an explicit way. And there may be time and place for that. But in fact, what you're sharing right now tells me that, in fact, being in a relative position, doing a job that has nothing to do with spirituality on the surface is way more helpful in the world.
Yeah.
So if we're interested in service to others, that's a better way to do it. Yes, I'm very big on that.
Because they could be having such a, well, I don't know their day-to-day life. I don't know what's going on. And all they see is me knock on the door, they answer. I'm polite. The genuine, like I make a little bit of conversation, and I don't know, maybe that's added something to their day. You don't know how that affects someone's day. That might lead them to think, what am I in this mood for? Why am I being like this? Like this random guy that I've never met before has been so polite, and you don't know how it affects people. And that's the way I like to think about it, and the way I like to see it.
Yes.
Definitely. But for me, Alan Watts was probably my first sort of influence. I think everyone's heard Alan Watts.
I feel a little weird saying this, but I've always seen Alan Watts's videos as recommendations on YouTube, but it's only recently, maybe like 5 days ago, that I was sent an Alan Watts video directly by a friend, and she said, "Oh yeah, check out Alan Watts. You will like him." And I had no idea about Alan Watts's teachings or style of communicating before that particular moment. So when you're mentioning Alan Watts, I'm not sure I can respond from a position of having a feeling of his particular way of teaching.
It's interesting for Alan Watts because, like you say, that's what happened for me, because I had the experience with the psychedelics, and then weirdly enough, an Alan Watts video got recommended, and I thought, because I'd had this deep experience, and the video title was something along the lines of duality. I thought, I'll just give it a watch. I just thought I'll give it a try, and I was blown away at the depth of what he was saying. And it's more about Alan Watts as the person he was, because he was just a person that was very curious and very interested in all these spiritual matters. And he traveled the world, and he actually went into every kind of tradition you could find, whether that's Kashmir Shaivism, whether that's the Taoist, whether that's all of these different ways. And what he did was he went into them all, discovered that all of them were teaching the same thing in a different way, brought it to the West, and taught them that what they're teaching is it's all pointing towards the same thing. And he made it in a way that the West could understand, because there was a time where the Eastern view was very different to the Western view.
It's interesting you're mentioning him. I remember just a couple of days ago, someone mentioned, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong about that Alan Watts died of alcoholism.
Yes.
Was that true?
Yes.
And I remember that fact about him sparking a conversation around, is spiritual teacher allowed to die of alcoholism?
Yeah.
And I just, that may take us on another route of exploration, perhaps maybe here, but I just want to mention something with regard to that. And this also has to do with the relation between spirituality, kind of the non-dual realization, and the more traditional fields of human development, psychotherapy being one of those domains. It's interesting that we tend to have our ideals as to what a spiritual person looks like, and we tend to kind of mix together human levels of development and enlightenment itself, the enlightenment state itself.
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn, and by the way, this informed greatly the method that I work with people in therapy with, when I learned that there is such a field as developmental psychology, which is very powerful. Leo Gura from actualize.org talks about it a lot. He's talked about spiral dynamics, that studies of how human mind evolves, how our values evolve, how they change in very predictable ways in humanity. So when we're looking at the world, for instance, right now, we can see that there are people who share very specific values, and then in their lives, they transition to a different set of values in a kind of linear fashion.
Yeah.
And that can be predicted. And it's just amazing that we can look at those studies by Susan Cook-Greuter and her study of levels of ego development, for instance, that start getting informed by non-dual consciousness in the higher levels. But it's just enlightening how people who have direct consciousness, who are enlightened, might actually be on this scale of human development in very, very different places. So it doesn't invalidate the fact that they have had this non-dual awareness, or that they're enlightened in common parlance, but they just might be on a very different level of human development. There is aesthetic development, there is cognitive development, all those different lines of development. Ken Wilber talks about it very nicely when he mentions waking up and growing up. Waking up is something that has to do with the consciousness, whether we're conscious of ourselves as what we truly are, and growing up has to do with our psyche's development, and both are really, really important areas of study, I think.
Yes, definitely. I went down that route of self-development, trying to change the way I mainly just trying to learn things, because I wasn't very attentive at school, but it's like after that experience, I was all of a sudden very interested in learning and developing, as like you say, developing as a person. And contrary to the fact that there's non-dual understanding, there's non-dual awareness. And like I say, that's one point that got me stuck for a while. It was putting the two together, and that's where I think the real transformation is, when we put together the non-dual understanding with the fact of personal development.
Yes. It's really great when you realize that awareness is doing the person.
Yeah.
Right? It's not the person kind of awakening to awareness. No, awareness is doing the person. Awareness is selfing.
Yes. It's bizarre but beautiful at the same time. Well, for me, it was interesting because that was the non-dual. This is something, a question I had. I'm not sure if you've ever been to a Rupert Spira. I've never been to a retreat, but I've been to his online webinars. And I've always had a question. I always thought I had a question going into it. And then by the time I've done the meditation, the question's gone. But so for me, they talk about the light of awareness. And for me, there was a moment, and I know they say that enlightenment's not a moment, and it's not a special moment or a special recognition. But for me, there was a kind of a moment like that where I was, because I'd started listening to Alan Watts after the recognition. There was like this chase for enlightenment. There was a chase for it. I was sort of hunting for it all the time. I was looking at every piece of information I could get. Well, maybe this piece of information could give it me. Maybe this piece of information could give it me. Maybe this tradition could give it me. And then it wasn't. And I remember being sat in the back garden, and I was like, I give up. I give up looking for it, because none of these things are giving it me. And then that's when it happened, because it was when I gave up the search for enlightenment. All of a sudden, everything became inclusive. There was nothing apart from me. Everything was me. Everything was the self. And the whole body reacted in a way that every cell in my body was sort of firing off with like this euphoria, this bliss. I can't even explain it. And then it was like a light. Do you know when you hear about people say when they have near-death experiences and they see the light? It was literally like that happened to me. And I closed my eyes and this light just consumed me. I felt myself expand. And I knew intuitively that this was God's presence. And I can't deny the fact that that's what I knew it was. And I'd listened to all this understanding, but I never really had that kind of connection to what I'd call God. Something I wouldn't have ever really said before. But after that experience, I could not deny the fact. And I was in tears after. That was the real transformation for me. But weirdly enough, I found Rupert Spira after that. And Rupert helped me understand what had happened during that experience. Because for a while that stuck with me. I just couldn't work it out what had happened. Even though I knew what had happened, I could not work it out what had happened. But you don't really...
Sorry.
But you don't really...
go ahead.
I've never really heard many stories that explain it like this. So it got me stuck for a while. Like, what had happened, I'm not sure.
Well, in general, I would say, including myself, I think many people are misinformed about the subject of enlightenment.
Yes.
Literally, when we read things about enlightenment, it sounds like a state. But, to be fair, that's the best you can convey it. And I think people do a great job at conveying it the best they can.
Yes.
Because enlightenment can only be grasped once you had one.
Yes.
So that it's really frustrating to be on a listener's end and to listen to all those masters and even kind of Joe Schmo saying that, I've had this enlightenment experience and it just went so amazing,
Yes.
It's just the bliss, it's harmony.
Yes.
And you're sitting there and you try to relate it to your experience. And then when things get even more confusing, and I would really love us to talk about this if we can, is when a higher self is brought into business. Yeah. It's like this distinction that is made between a lower self and a higher self. I think that is so confusing that literally, to me, that is an intention, and I recognize that the intention is very good behind it, but the discrepancy that is created that makes one think that there is two selves and they're both given equal validity. I think that is very confusing.
Yes,
go on.
It sort of creates like a sort of like, not a split personality, but it creates like this split version of yourself, and you're trying to think, well, how do I connect to this higher version of myself?
Am I speaking now from a lower self in my mind, or am I speaking from my higher self? How do I distinguish which self is speaking?
Yes, I had that for a while.
Yes, me too.
And it was trying to differentiate the two. But
yes.
For me, now after the integration, the experience makes sense. I don't even really need to ask the question anymore, because for me, what I realized is that moment, that recognition wasn't a moment in time. That was simply the pure awareness shining through, because I was chasing that experience again after, like a drug, because of how amazing, and I could not even put it into words how amazing it was. And I was chasing it and chasing it and chasing it. Even after the recognition, it's like, it was weird. You'd think you wouldn't even need to look for it after you found it. But even after I'd found it, I still continued to look for it, even though understanding what I did. And eventually I realized that it's always here now. I can't chase towards it. Chasing towards it actually runs away from it.
An interesting distinction that I think many people make regarding this is that whatever is bad, whatever is connected with suffering, that comes from the lower self. And whatever is blissful and loving and happy and peaceful and tranquil, that comes from the uppercase self.
Yeah.
So I think that is I don't think that it is perpetuated consciously. I just think that's a very natural and inadvertent conclusion that we come to when we're swimming in this non-dual ocean, when we listen to people on YouTube and on podcasts and stuff like that. That's natural. It's as natural as us inadvertently confusing our unlimited being with only one cluster of it, namely a body and a collection of thoughts and feelings. There is no evil plan behind it. And when people say sin, I think the word sin is very interesting. I think what is it called in English? Is it the original sin?
Yes,
so in religious communities, people may kind of question the validity of God, and very often they posit this argument: is God is love, as you are saying? Why do little babies? Why are they born with a sin? How have they sinned?
Yes.
And then maybe there will come a Buddhist and make a whole theory about past lives, and everything. So there is a lot of talk about that. But it's interesting that the word sin actually means mistake. It means confusion. Originally, etymologically, it means taking one thing for something that it is not.
Yes.
That's all that is to the word sin. That's it.
Yeah.
So I think realizing is that is also very important. So when we're talking to ourselves, I think this may be useful to some of the listeners who are trying to put things together, and going, oh, no, am I speaking? I'm suffering right now. Oh, this is on behalf of of the separate self. So I'm being the separate self now. No, we're always being one and the same thing. You are being you. And if you are suffering, you are suffering. And the suffering is also you. It's not some other thing that is also sharing the time and space with you. I
think suffering is probably the greatest teacher, because I think, like you say, if people were differentiating suffering with the lower self and bliss and stuff with the higher self, if they want to still make that distinction, I'd say suffering comes from the higher self, because suffering actually teaches us the most. In my experience, that's a
great way to put it.
In my experience, anyway, stop confusing the two. Anything that's easy, anything that's an easy pleasure or easy bliss comes from the lower self, because it's easy to get. But the suffering really comes from the higher self, because that's the most challenging. And once that's understood and overstood, then the real bliss shines through, I'd say, personally.
You talked about dissociation earlier, and I just felt like adding something that also touches upon what you just said. Dissociation is it's a very distinct state of being. And many spiritual teachers, I can actually see spiritual teachers and spiritual people making this new identification with what they think of as a higher self, and inadvertently they communicate from that position. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that in dissociation, what happens is a trauma, basically. So that brings us back to the trauma.
Yeah.
How I see trauma now as a therapist is an artificial fragmentation in consciousness, which nonetheless takes place. This may sound paradoxical, and I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
This is like when we arrive, we're whole and complete.
Yeah.
But then we learn that everything consists of parts. That's the first conclusion that we come to inadvertently. Yeah. So we make that assumption that everything is an object. I must be an object because everything that exists is an object. And I know somehow that I exist, so I must be an object. So that's how it's made. And everything consists of parts. And then if everything consists of parts, and sometimes we come across as something and we meet a negative reaction from our parents, for instance, you're being too loud, you're being too egotistical, then we learn that some parts of us are not okay.
Yes.
And that's how trauma is created. The wholeness splits. We make a distinction between egotistical and non-egotistical. Yes. And if our parent tells us off for being egotistical, then naturally we think that we need to become non-egotistical. Yes. And that's the part that we identify with. But this egotistical expression, it doesn't go anywhere by magic. It stays as an expression.
Yeah.
Yes, it's lingering, it's within us. And the integration therapy is called to recognize both within ourselves and become friends with both.
Yes.
And understand both.
With your therapeutic understanding, I can't remember, I've read about it once, and there's a way of describing trauma. It's like it's a moment frozen in time. I can't remember the exact word of it, the exact meaning, but it was like, say something happens that's very traumatic to a child and they can't process that moment because it's so extreme. It's like the mind, I think this is when I was learning about dissociation. It's like the mind sort of can't deal with that moment. So it puts it to the back. It's like, we need to just get out of this. We need to just get away from this feeling. So it puts it to the back of the mind, and it's like a moment frozen in time. And like you say, when a smell or a sound or something happens, it brings back that moment, and the moment replays again. And I think the moment keeps replaying until we can be comfortable with the moment that's happening. And that's when, I think, for me anyway, that's when I've really dealt with trauma, because I never really realized that I had PTSD flashbacks until I meditated. It was so bizarre. I never really realized it. When I got in these deep meditations, all of a sudden I started getting these flashes of memories of like pretty intense things from my childhood. And then,
Yes.
but coming from the meditation and those things were happening, I could process what had happened then. And then once that memory had happened and gone past, the emotions had come with it and the emotions left. They never came up again because I approached the memory, you could say, with this new understanding in a way that I could now process it when I couldn't back then.
Yes. Sorry, I'll have to restart my camera.
Yes, no worries.
What you're sharing made me think about a very useful distinction that I think we could make in therapy, and that is one between dissociation and suppression. I think what trauma implies, what happens in the moment of trauma, what you refer to as the moment frozen in time, right?
Yeah.
That's like when we recognize that part of us is unwelcome, it's unsafe.
Yes.
I think safety is such an important need. We all share it, safety and connection. So every time that we feel that something about us compromises our safety or the connection that we might have with others, then suddenly that part needs to be suppressed. Yes. So when we go through a very intense experience and we feel that being in a certain way is unsafe, what we will do, the natural protection mechanism for a human is to suppress it.
Yes.
That's what we'll do. And then later on in life, when we become adults and we start working with our trauma and we recognize that that the healing is wholeness, health is wholeness, right? We need to reconnect with that suppressed part of ourselves. But what makes things worse is that certain parts are not okay to express in our modern day society among adults. It's not that we're suddenly, once we go to a therapist, that we suddenly find ourselves in a perfect environment where everybody's like, you can be anywhere you need. That's very far away from that.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
So it requires a lot of courage. So that's why they call it the path of a warrior. It does require a lot of courage, because honesty requires a lot of courage.
Oh, definitely. And honesty with yourself, that's the biggest obstacle, I'd say.
Absolutely.
It's to face your inner demons and that I'd refer to as like your inner demons and your inner traumas and make friends with them.
Yes. So you were able to make friends with the suppressed parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Right? What you refer to as PTSD, and you were able to become friends with that again.
Yes, definitely. And that's when I actually felt more myself, strangely enough.
Yes. Yeah.
That's when I really connected, and then life just flows now. Life just is what it is, and I just go with whatever comes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I really wonder if the listeners to this podcast have also felt that there is something within ourselves that is not okay to express. I found that there is a lot of value in reconnecting with that which we don't feel is okay to express. Like for example, for me, that would be childlike innocence. I feel like there is a lot of that kind of childlike innocence within me. Like when I interact with people, I may make a joke, I may sit and just maybe do something very weird, like touch my hair, but I was educated out of that. And now it really takes me awareness to do that, because I was taught that is not okay.
Yes.
So I wonder if everyone, I'm sure everyone has that. And I think the greatest thing that we can do, even if we might not have to focus on enlightenment or anything, but one thing that we can do for ourselves is to define what it is within ourselves that is true about us, that we don't feel that we can express openly, and make it our personal challenge to express that, to find out how we can express that. Yes,
because like you say, today's society doesn't always allow us to act these certain ways and makes us and forces us to suppress these things.
Yes.
But the people like, when you hear people say, "Oh, this guy's nuts," but you typically find that those people are actually the happiest because they don't care what society thinks about them. They're happy.
And it's interesting.
They're happy to do what society says is wrong, but at the end of the day, they're the winners because they're happy.
Are they?
Yeah.
That it's interesting, you know, when I think that one reason for resistance that we may have towards the open expression of everything that we have within ourselves, our authentic truth, is that we feel that if I go about expressing whatever is true for me, I will end up shouting at people and calling them names. So it's like I will liberate my inner beast, and that beast will kill everybody.
Oh no, no, not that.
But that is not, and it's interesting that there may be an assumption that if I'm real, if I'm true, so you're asking me to become real. Okay, if I become real, I will become this beast. I will turn into this beast.
Yes.
But it's interesting that once we start exploring the anger, we notice that the more conscious we become of the root of our anger, the less drawn we are to act as a beast, because we learn that the root of the anger is hurt. And the root of the hurt is our inner sense of incapability to manage life, or unworkability, or the inherent lack of control that we have as a self. And there is a very good reason for why we have this lack of control. It's because there is no self who could either have control or not have control. So it's a legitimate realization that we have no control. But our mind is designed in a way when it tries to take us away from that realization, because that realization would be very painful and unacceptable to the sense of identity that we have built around ourselves in the world, where we should be masters of our own reality. So that's how it works.
Yes.
Well, the path of awareness doesn't mean kind of turning everything into rubble.
No.
People who turn everything into rubble, I would say they're the least aware.
Oh, yes, definitely, to destroy everything. And another point, Rupert Spira, for me anyway, has probably been the most clearest teacher. I'm not sure if you agree. Well, everyone's got their own version, but for me, Rupert Spira was really the one that Rupert Spira it's been like a bit of a therapist for me in a way. The way that he describes like certain emotions and stuff like that, it's like it really helps you understand it and integrate it, because it makes you realize that there's nothing wrong with it. It's just an expression of awareness.
Yeah, he's really great with words, isn't he?
Oh, he's amazing with words.
He finds he's so precise with the words that he picks. He has this background in pottery, so he was an artist, wasn't he?
Yes.
He was making pottery, and I think that when you're making pottery, when you're making dishes or whatever it is that you're doing artistic, it requires a lot of precision and understanding of very subtle distinctions. Like if your finger goes wrong in a wrong direction, you will ruin the pot or anything. That's how I imagine it, very simplistically in my mind. And I think this ability to be very refined in his art is informing Rupert Spira's communication of the truth. So it's very coherent with everything that he did.
He's so clear cut about everything. Like it's just so precise with his words. I often wonder like what his daily life's like. I know it's weird. I was talking about this in the last podcast with Beard Mystic. Like what's it like? How do they live their day-to-day life? How do they conduct their? Do you know, with them having such a deep understanding, it's interesting to wonder what their day-to-day life is. How would they deal with certain scenarios?
I got a little list, you know, just when I was thinking about the things that may come up during the podcast. I wrote down a list that is titled Day-to-Day Life. Can you see it?
No way.
So I find it very weird. I think we're like about an hour into the podcast, and so we haven't talked about day-to-day life. And I'm actually very happy that we that we haven't talked about it really, because to me that is indicative of the fact that there have been things that may be more universal and interesting to the listeners at large to learn about than the day-to-day life of one of the manifestations of our true nature.
Yes.
I think everybody's like a homeless person's day-to-day life is as much of a manifestation of awareness as it
Yes.
as and mystics,
Yes, definitely.
So I'm kind of very, very interested in delivering that message. But we can talk about the day-to-day life if you want. I would love to learn about your day-to-day life, what it's like.
Oh, it's very simple. I wake up, go to work. For me, it's weird now because for a while I was trying to. Part of the practice was trying to remain as that awareness during my day-to-day life. For a while it seemed like there was such an effort to keep going back, and I'd noticed that I'd keep switching between resting in pure awareness, being involved in the world, then resting back as awareness again, being back in the world, and then until eventually this sort of just merged together, and I'm always resting as awareness while at the same time acting in the world.
Yeah, right. And there comes a moment in your day-to-day interactions with every part of yourself when you're maybe you are hitting a cushion because it's in your way, and you recognize, oh, I'm just hitting myself. You don't have to verbalize it like that. An interesting thing about verbalization, by the way, is that, and also it has to do with telepathy, which you referred to earlier, is that I actually think that there will come a point in our evolution where we learn to communicate without using language that much, but rather by the means of what we may call nonverbal communication, because inherently realizations are nonverbal. Our thoughts are a nonverbal activity. I think sometimes, for instance, when people think about thought, we may think of thought as the words in our mind that are written somewhere here, just because we hear our inner voice here, just in our forehead. But an interesting thing about thought is that thought is at its root a nonverbal phenomenon. We may choose to wrap our thoughts in words, or we may choose not to. And I think an interesting practice for ourselves is to practice to not to envelop our eureka moments, our understandings, the way we think, into words. Simply because it's effective. It takes up a lot of time to verbalize what we think of. Maybe when we're sitting on a meditation cushion and we arrive at a realization, what is the first impulse? To verbalize it, right? To formulate it. And we mainly do that because that is a habit, but also we may do that to help us formulate that realization so that it stays with us longer, because we operate in language. But then we can kind of not do that at a certain point, and that would be a very interesting way of being.
Yes,
I think it would be very different from what we're used to.
It's interesting you said that, because for me, over time, like you say, integrating living the day-to-day life with pure awareness and doing the things in the world, I noticed that thoughts stopped coming up as much. Well, like you say, verbal thoughts. Like verbal
thoughts.
I don't really think in words much anymore. It's hard to explain. Like the verbal aspect of it's just slowly, because for me, I've classed it as sort of a superpower. Have you heard of aphantasia, where you can't visualize things? I think I've always had that. So for me, like, my mental activity has always been a bit different, because I don't think in images or necessarily think too much in words. I just think, in a way, think in emotion or think in the way I feel. I don't really verbalize it too much. And that's why for a while I struggled to express what I mean when I'm trying to explain things, because today's world's very much based on communicating verbally, and I struggle necessarily to formulate what I'm saying because I don't think in words too much.
Yeah, I get this. I really get this. And Rupert Spira, I think, he's one of those masters of verbal communication. I'm really excited about this subject. I think there is so much to be said here. Like, for example, when we realize that our thoughts are at their core non-verbal, then suddenly we see that our thoughts and our feelings are not as different as we used to think they were.
Yeah, they're the same thing.
Yes, they're the same thing, exactly. The reason why we may feel drawn to separate the realm of thought into a separate domain is because we see the thoughts as verbal constructions. They're like talk in our head. But once we see that a thought is not primarily the words, but the impulse, the energetic impulse that arises, that we may then choose or feel drawn to verbalize, then we see that our thoughts are just as transparent as our body, as our feelings, as everything we touch.
Yes.
You know, so that could be one way towards the recognition of our nature as inherently transparent. And I'm working on this interesting course right now. I don't know whether it will be a course or a book, or maybe I will just put it into a post, like 5 lines, and that will be it. I don't know yet. But I'm thinking of maybe describing the qualities, the so-called qualities of awareness, such as transparency, spaciousness, timelessness,
yes,
openness, and learning to embody these qualities in our day-to-day life in very practical ways, and then teaching practical ways of how people can do that.
Yes.
Because what happens after enlightenment is not a void. There is still experience. Yes, it is void and it is experience. So it's up to us what to do. We suddenly feel like that child when parents go on vacation and they leave the child a credit card, you know, maybe with $100,000, and suddenly the child is completely free. So the child can do whatever. Exactly. So after enlightenment, it's a bit like that, you know, given we go on the path of integration. And if there comes this moment in our life when we learn that, oh, you know, we can do everything. It doesn't really matter. Nothing has inherent meaning other than that we give it. So suddenly we can reconstruct everything that we want. And it's really freeing. That's the real liberation, the real freedom, I think.
Yes.
To add any meaning we want to things. So I think it would be very interesting to explore how we can embody the qualities that are apparent and inherent in consciousness in our day-to-day life. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that's something that the world needs is, like you say, a clear-cut way of including these things in the day-to-day life and a way to actually apply them.
Yeah.
In a way that's useful in the world. Because
right.
I think a lot of people hear the things like spaceless and timeless and stuff like that, and they hear it and they think, oh, it's some mystical stuff. And
and even if they had an enlightenment, they kind of may go, okay, so yeah, I've realized that my nature is this and this. So, well, just how do I live my life? So there is still that confusion. Enlightenment it does not give us some unity. It does influence the way we see things. So it's a difference in perspective, but there still may be patterns in our mind, or there may be activities like we may be doing a job. And wow, so what do we do now? Okay, I've had that question. So I really wanted to get more guidance and clarity as to what to do. Yes, so you do realize that you are this consciousness. So how do you live this life from the realization that you are the consciousness?
Yeah. Because you, in a way, as an aspirant as well, you expect that the moment you recognize this, everything will just make sense and everything will fall into place. But it's not. It's really the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's true. And maybe being spacious, one way of integrating that would be to make sure that you incorporate and embrace polarities. For example, when people talk about unity, especially in this modern day situation, you know, when the war is happening in the world. So when people talk about unity, what they mainly mean is the unity at the exclusion of the bad things. So it's like unity is about the good things, but what about the bad things? Don't they also comprise unity? So spaciousness, or kind of the absolute ability to integrate everything within yourself, like a space in a room, without questioning, I don't like that chair, you know, that is a real power. And I think we can cultivate this power within ourselves, and to see everything from this position. I actually incorporate everything. So I both incorporate the good stuff and the bad stuff, and the judgment as to whether this stuff is good or bad, you know, so it's all of that.
Yes.
And
So
yeah,
go on. Sorry,
sorry.
finish what you were saying.
Oh yeah, I was just saying that perhaps we could be deliberate about us doing that. So perhaps we could find within ourselves the polarities that we are very sensitive to. Maybe there will be a specific resistance. Maybe we don't like people of a particular race. And inner work is no time to be politically correct. Maybe we may find that we don't like a specific quality when it shows up in people, or a specific style. It could be whatever. So when we find that there is this dislike, then we can actually see, but I'm like the space in the room. Does the room care what color of the objects is walking into it?
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's funny you said that. I listened to that meditation the other day, Rupert Spira's, the yoga one, where he talks about the space in the room, and I think that's a really helpful way of understanding it. Is the space in the room any different than the space outside? It's just the wall that seems to make it seem limited to this particular space, and that was a brilliant way of putting it. Like this, that's the thing with Rupert. He's got such a practical way of putting it in words in a way that's applicable. And if you're trying to explore that, then good on you. Go down that road, I'd say. And did you say you're from Ukraine?
Yes.
How are you dealing with obviously the current situation? Like, that must be difficult. How's that challenged you?
Well, my family and I haven't suffered physically as much as people from other areas of Ukraine.
Yeah.
For example, we have a city called Mariupol, and Mariupol is now a ruin. Literally, it would be difficult to find a building there that hasn't been bombed or shelled. It's a total ruin. There's a lot of rubble. Like people, it's impossible to survive there, and many people, civilians, have died there. So obviously we're in Kyiv right now, which is the capital of Ukraine, and the greatest thing that we have felt would be a front line being very close to us. So a couple of days ago, Russians pulled back from the borders of Kyiv, and they left the Kyiv region mostly, but we were very close to the front line, and we could hear the shooting, the bombing, rocket launching, stuff like that. And we could hear explosions that were very, very loud. Wow. So we had to tape up our windows. And my husband made a little shelter in our flat, very far from the window, as much as he could, to make sure that if the windows would blow in, then we would be safe from the glass, because that is the most common reason for people getting injured, because they stand very close to the window, and then the explosion wave may just wipe them down.
Shatter the window, yeah.
Yes. So we have been kind of taking these very practical ways of making sure that we're secure and safe in our flat as much as we could. But there is this sense that there is no safe place in Ukraine to be, even though the western part of Ukraine had been relatively untouched at first. Then still certain towns and cities were attacked in the west of Ukraine. So many people were forced to leave their homes. Some were evacuated to other areas of Ukraine. Others were just, they chose to go to other countries. They were uprooted. So it has touched every one of us personally. Here, I find that the non-dual understanding and the seeing of truth has been very, very helpful, because it gives you perspective. So the perspective you take is very different onto everything that is happening. It doesn't make you passive, though. For example, I set up a little option for people who want to support my work on Patreon to chip in, and all the money from that tier I'm using to help the people in need here. Yes. So for instance, yesterday, my husband and I, we met a wonderful old lady called Vera, and Vera lives just down the road. She's a pensioner. She's in her 70s, and pensioners are known to be very poor in Ukraine. They receive very, very minimal support from the government. I think a pension in Ukraine, the average, the minimal pension rather, would have to be like $60 or something. And you have to pay your bills from that pension. You have to go to the pharmacy and buy medication using that money. So that's like $60 per month. And every time you go to a shop, I think like the average purchase would have to be maybe $20 to $30. So that's mind-blowing how they survive, those pensioners. And many of them, they don't have food to eat in normal times, not to mention wartime.
Yeah.
So when I met Vera, first and foremost, I felt lucky because the universe paired us up.
Yeah.
So very naturally, I offered her support, and she said, yes, if you could help with medication and food, I would be very grateful. So that was something that we were doing today. And the non-dual understanding does not prevent people from being effective in this way. It's not that, you sit there in a lotus pose and go, it's all a game, guys. Yeah, we're all enlightened. It doesn't really matter, even when good doesn't exist.
But that's
not how it works.
It's another way, like we were saying, bringing the understanding into the world and using it in a way that's effective in the world. And that's a good thing.
And you want to do that. It's a very natural impulse. You want to do that.
Yeah, you naturally just want to help people, and even if that's just helping them understand something, or answering a simple question, or even just getting them some shopping, like you say. It comes in many forms. It's not one particular way. It's not limited to a teacher.
True.
Whatsoever.
That's very true. Yes.
So
we have been dealing with that.
Well, you've been dealing very well with it, from what you're telling me. Like, that's crazy. It makes you realize, like, because over here in the UK, like, it makes you realize how privileged you are to not be in that scenario, and it does make you feel for the people over there. It is terrible what you're going through, but there are many things that the fact that you're remaining so calm and optimistic it's impressive, really, to be honest. And it's a reflection of your understanding, to be honest, because I can imagine that it's chaos over there for some people. Many people here are learning spiritual truths without recognizing that they're learning spiritual truths. For example, gratitude, what you are mentioning right now. So many people have messaged me recently saying that just thanks to this situation in Ukraine, people are realizing how happy and lucky they are to have what they have. Like, for example, I was in touch with a wonderful woman from America who really loves exploring nature. She loves hiking and driving, and she takes wonderful photographs of everything that she sees. And I was sharing with her that for us, opening our window, unblocking the window a little bit and looking at a patch of light, of sunshine, entering the flat in the morning, to us, that is such a great thing. And it's not a figure of speech. It's a real feeling of gratitude that you have after not being able to go outside or look at the sky or anything. And many people are in a position like that. I'm telling you, I'm not in the worst position relative to these things. Many people have spent their lives in, I mean, this month, the recent month, they have spent it in a basement. A friend of a friend told me that he was captured in a basement without food and water for many days before he could actually go out and flee from that terrible situation. So it's not that, like, this is something that I read on the news. This is a person who I know, who told this to me directly, who went through this experience and had this massive trauma that now is in his face, and he has no idea how to deal with it. He doesn't have a non-dual understanding. So to him, if I came up to him and said, oh, mate, it's all just perfect. I would not be surprised if he punched me in the face. Honestly, I would punch myself in the face if I were him. There's definitely, I've learned this, there's an appropriate time to speak about it, and there's other times where it's not appropriate to speak about it. It's very relative.
Absolutely.
Very relative, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's why people like myself, I find myself in this country in a position where I need to be extra vigilant as to the things that I say, so that I don't provoke resistance. Rupert Spira actually gave me this amazing advice. I'm very grateful to him for that. He said that the last thing that you want to do when you are trying to help someone is to provoke resistance.
Yeah.
So it's really important, this help may take very different manifestations, as you said, buying products or medication or groceries. So it's not as explicit, and maybe in non-dual communities around the world where the situation is very different. But we're also very drawn to put our attention on the physical, which also has to do with the dissociation. It may be natural for people in the spiritual community to identify with the non-physical, but here in Ukraine, our attention is on the physical.
Yes.
It cannot not be on the physical. Otherwise, we won't survive.
No.
So this is also something that we're called to integrate.
Yeah, there's a time to focus on one more than the other.
Yes.
Especially in your situation.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I think it'd be a good place to wrap it up there.
Yes, thank you.
I'd definitely
thank you for having me.
I'd definitely do this again, part 2, if you're up for it at some point.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
There are so many things that we could talk about. I really enjoyed talking to you. You are so open-minded. I really love how you embody this curiosity for people. And I really hope people benefit from listening to a conversation like this. And if they have any questions, I'm pretty sure they will spark other episodes. Yeah,
it's just been one of those things that just spontaneously come to me. Like I was looking for a way to express this understanding I had, and I couldn't find a way to channel it. And I thought, what better than a podcast?
Yeah, very natural.
A very natural way of doing it. So it's been a pleasure having you on. Thanks for your wisdom, your guidance.
Thank you.
And your understanding. So
thank you so much.
Lovely.
I hope to talk to you again.
Yes, definitely.
That would be lovely.
Thank you for coming on, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Great.